The Atari 2600 was one of these consoles that I didn't get to experience until I was much older. Well, the first time I ever experienced it was actually when I was 4 years old. At the time, I didn't know what to think. I don't know, it was my first revelation as a kid that there were consoles before Nintendo. I just remember thinking this is like a really old thing. And it wasn't until later when we started collecting video games, when we started getting more consoles, I was starting to hear stories from Dad about the Atari 2600 and how it was this console that basically ushered in this entire video game thing. It was the OG, the original. Eventually, I asked my dad, I said, Dad, I want to start collecting Atari.
It! In the box!
In the box!
Look at that! What does it say?
Atari!
My entire Atari journey really took off at that point, and we started collecting games like crazy for the Atari 2600 to the point where I had an entire row of games on my wall. This was just amazing. What an amazing time of collecting. We were on a mission to find old video games, and man, some of the best days. Some of the best days. But first, a word about this video's sponsor, Cook Unity. Ah yes, many a home-cooked meal was served in this dining room.
My little boy, you eat the spaghetti.
Life isn't as simple as it used to be, and it's hard to find the time to prepare a home-cooked meal like the old days. Thankfully, we have Cook Unity. Cook Unity is the first chef-to-consumer platform delivering freshly prepared, pre-selected meals right to your door weekly. Choose from hundreds of meals and pick the ones you'd like. Cook Unity chefs offer up a wide range of meals with over 7 different dietary preference filters, including vegan, paleo, and gluten-free options. The subscription is super flexible and you can pause, skip weeks, or cancel at any time. One of the meals I received was a delicious fettuccine alfredo with rosemary chicken breast, prepared by Chef David Adan, the kind of Italian cooking Mama used to make.
To our Italian family.
Arrivederci.
Overall, guys, I found this to be a great service. The meals come pre-cooked to your door. All you have to do is heat them up in the oven or microwave, and you're good to go. The flavor is next level, and they really surprised me with their portion size. Go to cookunity.com/retro50 or click on the link in the description below and use my code retro50 to get 50% off your first order of Cook Unity meals to try them out for yourself. Thank you, Cook Unity, for sponsoring today's video.
Can you say bye-bye to the camera?
Bye-bye.
Let's go ahead and jump into number 10. Gremlins on the Atari 2600. It just barely made it on the list because Gremlins was one of my favorite movies of all time. So when it came time to collect for the Atari 2600, I was like, I need Gremlins. I need Gremlins. And Gremlins is kind of a rare Atari 2600 game. And I really recommend it. The gameplay is a lot like Kaboom. If you've ever played Activision's Kaboom, instead of catching bombs like you do in Kaboom, you're catching the Gremlins and you're making sure they don't eat after midnight. Those are hamburgers on the bottom of the screen. And you got to make sure they don't eat after midnight. And this is like a scene 1. And there's a second stage. They have become Gremlins. And it's more like a Space Invaders type of game in this stage. And then when you get through this stage, of course, it repeats. And there was nothing wrong with that. You know, Atari 2600 games were really simple back then. And it was all about challenge, and it was all about high score. My number 9 is going to be another franchise-based game, SpiderMan. This is a classic Atari 2600 game. Now, this is definitely one of those games that winds up on top 10 lists. This one is really special to me for a lot of reasons. It came out before I was born in the early 80s, when my grandfather, Mike Esposito, he was still a part of Marvel Comics. That's right. A lot of you may not realize or know this because I haven't really talked about it a whole lot. But my grandfather was a inker for Marvel and DC back in the Silver Age of comics. He's very well known in the comics industry. We lost him in 2010. Miss you, Grandpa. That SpiderMan was the #1 comic that Grandpa inked. But I used to think that maybe, I used to wonder, did Grandpa do this artwork? Because it's Spider-Man artwork. And you know what? I've done some research and I don't think Grandpa did this artwork. It would have been so legendary if he did. But as far as I can tell, he did not. Regardless, Spider-Man on the Atari 2600 is such a beloved game for me. I absolutely adore it. It's one of the best on the Atari 2600, and I want you to check it out if you haven't already. All right, well, coming in at number 8, it is Tunnel Runner. You saw it earlier in the video when I was playing it in 1990 with my cousins. The first Atari 2600 game I ever saw in my life. It's special for a lot of reasons. Not only was it the very first Atari game I ever played or ever saw, but it kind of is the unofficial theme or sound effect on my videos. And Tunnel Runner is just such a unique game. I just love how this game is like a 3D game in an age where 3D was absolutely unheard of. A lot of people don't talk about it, and it kind of boggles my mind. It blows my mind that, you know, this one isn't more talked about. And this is a game that, as you walk through the corridors, you encounter these monsters, these creatures, and it's so freaky, and it's one of those games that is incredibly suspenseful, especially when you're a little kid playing it at night. Oh my gosh, crazy stuff, guys. But definitely, it's got to be in your collection. It's a special one for the channel for basically having the sound effects, but oh man, this one is very special to me in my memories of video games.
Ghostbusters! Is that Ghostbusters? Pac-Man. Sort of.
This was the first Atari game I ever played. Here at number 7, it's Plaque Attack. Now, Plaque Attack is one of these games where it's so innovative that I can't help but love everything about it. Now, I love Space Invaders type games, you know, shooters, classic shooters. And here you have a game that I swear must have been developed by a dentist. And man, what an ingenious idea for a shooter. As you go through each stage, the patient or whoever, you know, the character is, the protagonist who's got his giant mouth open, keeps shoving French fries and hamburgers, and instead of a spaceship, you have a roll of toothpaste. And if the fruit or the enemy gets to your teeth, it starts rotting it. And it's just such a unique take on Space Invaders. I used to love playing Plaque Attack on my Atari 2600. I played it more on the Activision Greatest Hits collection, or maybe it was called Activision Classics. It was on Mac and PCs. Back in the 90s, it was a PC collection on CD-ROM of Activision games. One of the very first video game collections I ever had or played. And I used to love playing Plaque Attack on there. In fact, I think I may have been introduced to the game through that CD-ROM. What a great, innovative game. I don't hear a lot of people talking about Plaque Attack. It's definitely one of those titles that needs some some more love on the Atari 2600. Well, let's move on, guys. Coming in at number 6, it is Berserk. This is often considered one of the greatest games ever made in the classic era of games, the golden era of Atari and arcades. I actually was sent this brand new copy of the brand new Atari 2600 Berserk that has been released by Atari. Atari actually is making brand new games right now. They've re-released their original Atari 2600. Here is the Atari 2600 Plus console. Atari actually sent this to me recently with Berserk, and it's fantastic, guys. I highly recommend you check out this brand new Atari game. And it's so cool to have Atari back in the console business in some way, making brand new games. This is just such an addictive game. I love the gameplay in Berserk. It's one of these games that I could play for hours and hours on end because of the addictive nature. Going from room to room, killing the robots and just, I don't know, I just love the animation on your figure. It's one of those early Atari games that really showed a full figured character. It was one of the earliest to do so, and that was really groundbreaking back then because a lot of the early stuff just was like dots on the screen and hard to make out. But this was just next level back then, and there's a reason why this is considered one of the most classic video games of all time. Berserk was actually also one of Dad's favorite Atari games. I used to hear him talk about Berserk all the time, and I actually never collected Berserk back in the day. For whatever reason, we never had it on Atari 2600, but I remember him talking about it and we just never got our hands on it. I don't know why, but I have played it many times since then, and on various other consoles via emulation, just in the arcades. And Berserk is just so good. It's such a classic. I love it so much, and that's why it is where it is on the list. Let's go ahead and jump into number 5. Now this one, guys, we're back to the franchises, and it's Roadrunner on the Atari 2600. As you can see, this is just a beautiful looking game. It's just, I mean, as far as Atari graphics goes, this is some of the best. You've got like something close to parallax scrolling happening. It's not exactly, but it's trying to mimic that style. And the object of this game is just like the classic Roadrunner cartoons. You got to stay ahead of Coyote, not get caught by the Coyote, and collect the bird seed as you run down the road. And there's a bunch of different stages here. This was one of the most graphically impressive Atari games I ever saw. And I remember collecting this with Dad back in the day. We got it in one of our great Atari 2600 hauls. And man, this just blew my mind. I think I had played the NES game. I remember renting the NES game quite a bit back then. And the fact that this was so close in style and graphics to the NES game really just made me love it all the further. Like I to this day think that this is a golden Atari 2600 game. Unfortunately, it doesn't get released on collections or talked about much because it's a franchise game. And it's one of the best franchise games I ever played in my life. If you haven't played Roadrunner on the Atari 2600, you gotta check it out. It's one of the best ones ever. But let's go ahead and move on here. We got a classic coming up. Now this had to be on the list, right? This just had to be on the list. Adventure. The original Adventure made by Atari. This one is one of the most infamous games of my retro life, in that my dad adored this game. The way my dad reacted to buying this game again and owning it, it was like he became a kid right before my eyes when he first introduced me to Adventure. This game was so groundbreaking in that nobody back then had ever played a game really that took you onto different screens. That, you know, this is the original Zelda, basically. Like, without Adventure, you don't have Zelda. Incredibly simplistic. You're just a dot on the screen. You have to really use your imagination here. But Adventure is so beloved and classic for a reason. You got to take these chalices to the individual castles, and then your stage starts again. Adventure, one of the greatest Atari games ever made. So much of the video game industry, and we owe so much to Adventure, and I had to feature it on this list for that reason. Let's go ahead and move on to the next game on the list. Number 3, Keystone Capers. This was just a game that I remember playing on that Activision collection, back on that Activision collection that came out on the Mac and PC. I remember playing it and thinking, here's another brilliant Activision game with such an ingenious concept where you are a Keystone Cop chasing a burglar through a department store. It's like supposed to be a mall. And you have to take these elevators up and around the screen and try to catch the robber. And you see him on the bottom of the screen, that little dot moving around by the escalator. That is the robber. And there was just a lot of scope in this game. It's just so brilliantly designed. I mean, look at the top of the screen. You've got this like sunset happening and the city skyline. I mean, it looks so primitive, but this was such a fun one, you know, jumping over. It kind of felt like a combination of Donkey Kong mixed with like elevator action. This was a great game. I loved playing this game, and it was so addictive to me back in the day. And again, this is Activision at their very best. Just incredible sprite work. Everything's so articulated. The sound effects are fantastic. They stand out, classic Atari. And if you guys have not played Keystone Capers, definitely check it out. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty here. The last two on the list. And coming in at number 2, we have a game that, you know, I almost forgot about this game. It's so funny. You think to yourself, why would you forget one of your favorite Atari 2600 games? Well, there's so many. There's so many Atari 2600 games, and a lot of them have very similar gameplay. And I almost forgot about this one, but it is truly one of the best. Some would say it's like the best Atari games ever made, and that is Hero. Activision, again, with the heavy hitters. This was such just an ingenious concept of a game. Cavern exploring games were really like my favorite genre of games on the Atari 2600. And Hero just kind of felt like the proto-Metroid. I mean, this game inspired so many games. The fact that you're going down into this chasm, this cavern, where I guess spelunkers are, they've fallen into the mountain and they can't get out. They have to be rescued. And you're part of that rescue team. You're the hero. And you come in blowing up walls with dynamite, finding these people way deep down into the Earth's core. This was another game that I experienced on that Activision PC Macintosh CD-ROM. That was where I played a lot of Atari games and got to experience them for the first time before I ever ended up collecting them. I had to put it on this list, not just because of, you know, what I think of it, but because of what so many people in the retro gaming world think of it. It's one of the, it's not widely known, but for those who love Atari and know Atari, they know Hero is one of the best. And so to see where it began, to see where those ideas were starting to come into fruition on the Atari 2600, it gives extra points to a game. And so Hero, one of my favorites. Before we get to my number 1 pick, here's an honorable mention from special guest Jacobians.
Hello everybody, I'm Ryan the Blue, reviewer of games, consoles, and accessories over on my channel, Jacobians. Kaboom! One of Activision's classic outings, I would argue it should have more of a legacy than Pitfall Harry. I know some would agree with that. With a paddle controller in hand, the object is to stop the bombs being dropped by the mad bomber above for as long as you can to rack up enough points. The challenge will only increase as you go along, and it never changes much after that, not that it has to anyway. To me, this game showcases the challenge of the arcade, the imagination of the developer Larry Kaplan, and the originality the system can possess at times. Though this was more than likely a better clone of Atari's Avalanche arcade game. I couldn't recommend this title enough. Get it for your Atari when you can, and thanks Tyler for letting me come on and talk about it. And Manny, if you're watching, I would love to play against you in this sometime. This and Tunnel Runner. I might have your number.
You've waited this long. It's time to finally talk about my favorite Atari 2600 game. And that is, of course, got it right here. Ready, guys? E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Oh my gosh, this game is, I swear, it should be one of the best games. It should be on top 10 lists across the world. Number 1. It's so good. I can't believe what they were able to accomplish with this game. And everything I'm saying right now is complete and utter nonsense. I am lying through my teeth. E.T., one of the worst games ever made. I had to feature it here because, I mean, why not? It's sitting there in front of me. I have to feature it somehow. Stay away from this game. This is one of the worst games ever made, and it nearly killed the video game industry. That is a story for another time. Let's go to the real number 1, shall we? The real number 1 is Pitfall. Actually, it's not this one. It's Pitfall 2. Pitfall 2 is one of the greatest games ever made. And honestly, it belongs on my top, 50 games list. It's way up there, top 25 games. As I mentioned before with Hero, I absolutely adore cavern exploring games. To me, they are some of the most fun and explorative games I've ever played. I love using my imagination and going through caverns in old school video games. And Pitfall 2 just took what was fantastic about the original Pitfall and just turned it into a much bigger world. The fact that you could fall down into the cavern and start exploring not just the jungle setting, but the cavern itself. Going around trying to find all the gold. There's actually a way to beat this game. Very few Atari games had a way to beat the game. There's an ending. There's a way to get from the start to the finish. It doesn't loop like so many arcade classic games and Atari games that were all, based on getting the highest points or score. Pitfall 2 was about exploring. It was about finding secrets and challenging you to draw an entire map. This was way before the internet, and I'm sure so many people out there probably played this game, realized how big it was, and decided to draw a map of each screen to help get them through it. There are so many awesome moments in this game, and later Pitfall 2 would be sort of reimagined as Super Pitfall, and that came out on the NES. And Super Pitfall is by far one of the worst games ever. It's such a bad game. But Pitfall 2, which is on the Atari 2600 and came out before Super Pitfall, is infinitely better. So that's a rare example of an Atari 2600 game being better than an NES game that was, supposed to be next generation. Pitfall 2, one of the best. Pitfall, the original Pitfall, is one of the most famous games in my family. It was one of my Aunt Michelle's favorite games, one of my dad's favorite games. Pitfall 2. What else can I say? It's my favorite Atari 2600 game, and if you have not played Pitfall 2, you got to check it out. It's one of the best.